History, arguably the single most important cultural property. It is the great unifier of all societies, from classical to contemporary. It is happening all around us, every second, every minute, every hour of every day. A conspiracy of coincidence. It creates the contextual understanding of events that affects our lives. If we are vigilant enough, we can witness it happening. If we are keen enough, we can make it happen. By understanding it, we can alter the reality of the present or change the trajectory of the future. For without history, we are without purpose. We are without identity. Welcome to the gray area, where we examine history in hindsight. February 9th, 1825, the U.S. House of Representatives elected John Quincy Adams president, as no candidate had received a majority of electoral vote. 1861, the Provisional Congress of the Confederate States of America elected Jefferson Davis as its first president. 1870, the United States Weather Bureau was authorized by Congress. The Bureau is officially known as the National Weather Service. 1884, Thomas Edison and Patrick Kinney executed a patent application for a chemical recording stock quotation telegraph. 1885, the first arrivals of Japanese to Hawaii happened this day in 1885. 1926, teaching the theory of evolution is banned in Atlanta, Georgia schools. The reason, quote, it compromised the position and integrity of the long-held values and beliefs of white purity, which we hold dear, reducing our position in the hierarchy of humanity, making us equal or even inferior to the Negro, end quote. Henry Dickerson McDaniel, Democratic Governor of Georgia. 1942, U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff held its first formal meeting to coordinate military strategy during World War II. 1942, daylight savings, or otherwise known as wartime, went into effect in the United States. 1943, during World War II, the Battle of Guadalcanal ended with an American victory over Japanese forces. 1950, U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy charged that the State Department was riddled with communists, and this was the genesis of what is known as McCarthyism. McCarthyism is a political strategy to discredit political opposition by accusing them of being communist. 1971, the Apollo 14 spacecraft returned to Earth after mankind's third landing on the moon. 1984, NBC Entertainment President Brandon Tartikoff gave an interview in which he espoused the, quote, 10 Commandments for TV programmers. 1989, Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts and Company completed the $25 billion purchase of RJR Nabisco Incorporated. 2001, American submarine, the USS Greenville, accidentally strikes and sinks the Japanese fishing vessel known as the Ehime Maru, Warrior Princess, a Japanese training vessel operated by the Uejima Fishery High School, in which 9 of the Ehime Maru's crew members were killed, including 4 high school students. It was one of the major blunders in modern U.S. naval history. 2014, protests erupt in Sarajevo and other cities in Bosnia Herzegovina in response to the declining economy, which left a tremendously high unemployment rate amongst Bosnians. The unemployment rate remains at approximately 40% and 57% for the youth to this day. However, rewinding all the way back to 1906, Paul Laurence Dunbar was an African-American poet and author who was born June 27, 1872. His parents had been slaves during the American Civil War, but had been freed by the time of his birth. Dunbar was born in Ohio, and his parents separated shortly after his birth due to his father pursuing work in an industrial center. Dunbar began writing poetry as early as 6 years of age. He was an avid poet and started publicly reciting his poetry at the age of 9. His mother assisted him in his schoolwork and learned to read and write solely to aid her son's education. She often read the Bible to him and hoped that he would eventually become a minister. Dunbar was the only African American student at his high school. He was a well-liked and popular student and was the head of the school's literary society. Also, he was the editor of the school newspaper and a member of the debate club. In 1888, at the age of 16, Dunbar published 2 poems titled Our Martyred Soldiers and On the River in a Dayton-based newspaper called The Herald. 2 years later, he wrote and edited the first edition of a weekly African-American paper called The Tatler. It was printed by his high school classmates Wilbur and Orville Wright. Yes, the same Wilbur and Orville who would create America's first airplane that took flight, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The paper only lasted for 6 weeks, but it gave Dunbar good exposure to the literary world. Paul Laurence Dunbar completed his high school education in 1891 and had hoped to study law. However, being unable to afford it at the time, he took a job as an elevator operator instead, drawing a salary of only $4 per week. He continued to write poetry and asked his friends, the Wright brothers, to publish his books of poems, who in turn referred him to United Brethren Publishing House. And his first book of poems, titled Oak and Ivy, was published by the publishing house in 1893. He would sell subsidized copies of the book to passengers in the elevator in order to recover the cost of investment. His work caught the attention of another poet by the name of James Whitcomb Riley, among others, who offered to put him through college. However, Dunbar wanted to focus exclusively on writing. His work began to gain popularity, and he was invited to read at literary gathering. In 1896, Dunbar published his second book of poetry titled Majors and Minors. Despite the successful sales of his books and his rising popularity, he was still under financial duress and was heavily indebted. His second book received positive reviews in literary circles and brought him national acclaim. He then published his first 2 books in collective form under the title Lyrics of Lowly Life, with an introduction by the acclaimed critic William Dean Howells. Paul Laurence Dunbar would also go on to venture into writing short stories, novels, lyrics for musicals and plays. His first collection of short stories was titled Folks from Dixie, and it was published in 1898. He wrote 4 novels, which did not receive positive reviews, as his writing would become more and more radical. But he would switch gears into writing lyrics for Broadway musicals, one specifically titled Enda Horny, which was a hit in both the U.S. and the U.K. and ran successfully for almost 4 years. In 1897, Dunbar successfully toured the U.K., reciting his poetry at various events. Upon his return to the U.S., he married the author known as Alice Ruth Moore. However, within a few years of his marriage, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. His health began to fall, and he separated from his wife in 1902. He spent the last few years of his life with his mother in Dayton, Ohio, and he died on this day in 1906 at the young age of 33. Nevertheless, his wife, the esteemed Alex Ruth Moore, would go on to continue publicly reciting his works as she had never lost a moment's love for him. She would even go on to try to attempt to publish his unpublished works that he kept in his own secret diary, which reveals his more radical intent to incite social change. And he would become an inspiration to many radical authors, one of such being the esteemed Amiri Baraka, who before he died wrote, "Media and the arts are a weapon of revolution." And all of these years later, he couldn't be more right. Here is a man who history smiles upon him favorably. He was industrious, he was forward-thinking, hard-working, and he did not wait for something. No, he made it happen. And though his works may not have had the intended effect that he secretly desired, his sacrifice would not go unnoticed. And every black author, poet, writer, journalist owes the esteemed Paul Laurence Dunbar a debt of gratitude, because if it were not for him laying the groundwork, we very well may not have the rich literary history of Ebon Noblesse that we have today. Today, February 9th, whether officially or unofficially, could be considered Dunbar Day in honor of the esteemed Paul Laurence Dunbar. You see, history, much like time, waits for no man. It is ultimately up to us to decide whether we choose to make it or be the reason we repeat it. However, no matter what side of it that you stand on, you can only learn from it by looking at history in hindsight.